The Duke of Calder came home across his own saddle, and the only one who did not step back from the sight was the wife the county still called an upstart. The heat of that August night lay over the drive like a hand pressed flat, and under it Gerard Ashworth's face had gone the colour of tallow. His hair matted dark at one temple, his breathing so shallow that for 3 full seconds she could not find it at all. She found it. She said his name once, quietly, the way a woman says a word she does not expect to be answered, and then she stopped saying anything, and began instead to give orders, and the grooms, who had not taken an order from her in 6 months, without first glancing at someone else for permission, obeyed her without glancing at anyone at all. It was the first time in that house she had been obeyed as though she belonged there. It would not be the last, though it would be a long while before anyone admitted it. They carried him up the west stairs, past the portraits of Ashworth dukes, who had none of them, so far as the family liked to tell it, married beneath themselves, and into the room that had been his father's and his grandfather's before that, and Verity walked beside the litter with one hand resting on the frame of it, not because she could do the men's work of carrying him, but because she could not make herself let go. The physician came within the hour, a neat, watchful man named Absalom Reeve, who kept a gold watch chain that he touched when he was thinking of what to say rather than what was true. And he examined the Duke by candlelight, with his mouth set in the particular grave-line physicians keep for households that can afford to be told the worst gently. "A fool," he said. The horse had come home without its rider for the better part of a mile before anyone found the place where Gerard Ashworth had gone down, and no one had yet worked out what had frightened so steady an animal into bolting. Reeve did not say the word death. He did not need to. He said instead that the Duke might wake within the week, or within the month, or not at all, and that in the meantime he must not be moved, must not be excited, must be kept, above all still. Verity heard the word still, and felt it settle into her like a stone dropped into a well, sinking long after the sound of it had stopped. Word went out to the family before the candles in the sick-room had burned an inch. It went, first and fastest, to Mr. Julian Vane, who was cousin to the Duke on his mother's side, and heir presumptive in the absence of any child of the marriage, and who arrived at Calder House before noon the following day, in a carriage that had clearly not spared its horses, and yet stepped down from it looking as though he had not hurried at all. He was a beautiful man in the particular way that unsettles rather than reassures, smooth-shaven, faultlessly dressed even after a night on the road, his voice pitched so low and so gentle that servants leaned in without meaning to. He went first to the sick-room, and stood a long while at the foot of the bed with his hands folded, and when he spoke it was not to the Duke, but about him, to the room in general, in the tone of a man already composing an epitaph. "Poor Gerard," he said. "Poor, poor Gerard." He did not raise his voice. He had never needed to. By the second day a messenger had gone from Calder House to the county town, and by the 4th day it was known below stairs, and therefore known everywhere that Mr. Vane, as the nearest kinsman and a man of established prudence, intended to petition the county's justices for a commission of inquiry into the Duke's condition, so that some responsible hand might be appointed to manage the estate should his Grace not recover his senses. It was, everyone agreed, only sensible. Estates did not run themselves, and quarter day was coming, and the tenants would want to know who to pay. The hearing was set, at Mr. Vane's own suggestion, for the last day of the month. 4 weeks. Verity, standing in the doorway of her husband's sick-room, with her mother's small tin case of measuring spoons still in her apron pocket, where she had carried it every day of her life since she was 12 years old, understood without being told that 4 weeks was not being offered to her as mercy. It was being offered to her as a deadline, dressed in the clothes of patience, and she meant, God helping her, to use every day of it. She had married him in February, in a small cold room with a fire that smoked, and a clergyman who kept glancing at the door as though expecting someone to stop the proceedings, and there had been no one there to stop them, because there had been no one, on either side, who cared enough to try. Gerard Ashworth had come to her father's house, not to court her, but to settle a debt her father owed his late uncle, a debt that had grown, through 6 years of poor harvests and worse investments, into a sum that would have put her father in a debtor's gaol, and put Verity, at 26, onto the charity of relations who did not want her. The Duke had proposed the arrangement across her father's own dining table, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man discussing the sale of a horse. He required, he said, a wife of sense rather than fashion, since he had buried one wife already for love, and did not intend to bury feeling along with a second. He required someone who would manage his houses competently, receive his guests correctly, and make no claims upon him beyond what the law of the Church required. In exchange her father's debt would be cancelled, her sisters dowered, and she herself given a settlement that would keep her, whatever became of the marriage, from ever again being anyone's burden. It was not romance. It was arithmetic, offered plainly, and Verity, who had spent 6 years watching her father drown by degrees, and had grown very tired of being the daughter who was clever, but not pretty, the one the neighbours called sharp rather than lovely, had looked at that arithmetic and found it, on the whole, honest. You need not love me, she had told him, across that same table. With her hands folded the way her mother had taught her to fold them, when she wanted her voice steadier than her heart. You only need me. He had studied her for a long moment with the particular stillness she would come to know very well, the stillness of a man taking the measure of a thing, before he decided whether to trust it. Then I will need you, he had said. It is, I find, the easier promise to keep. They had shaken hands on it, like men closing a sale, and something in the plainness of that handshake had comforted her more than any declaration could have done, because it asked nothing of her that she could not deliver. Nan Cobbett, who had nursed the last Duchess and 2 dukes' worth of Ashworths before her, and who regarded most persons under 60 as unfinished, had watched the wedding from the back of the church, with her arms crossed, and pronounced afterward that it was a poor sort of wedding, but might yet make a decent sort of marriage, which from Nan was as near to a blessing as the county had ever heard her give. Love's a fire you build, she told Verity on the first night at Calder House, setting down a tray with the clatter of a woman who did not believe in ceremony. Bargains is kindling. Don't scorn what lights the thing just because it isn't the thing itself. Verity had scorned nothing. She had gone about her new duties with the same brisk competence she had once brought to keeping her father's ledgers from ruin, had learned the tenants' names before the steward could learn hers, had found within a season that the household ran more smoothly under her hand than it had under any that came before, and had told herself, each night, that this was enough. That being needed was a country she could live in comfortably, even if she never saw the country called being loved. The county had not been kind about it. A duke who married a penniless girl with ink-stained fingers and a dead apothecary for a mother was, in the drawing-rooms of the shire, assumed to have been managed, and the girl herself assumed to have done the managing, and Verity had learned to hear the word fortune hunter in the particular silence that fell when she entered a room a half-second too early. She had borne it the way her mother had taught her to bear most things. Stillness is not surrender, her mother used to say, measuring drops into a blue glass bottle with a hand that never shook no matter what news had come that day. It had been true of tinctures. Verity had not yet learned whether it was true of marriages. Julian Vane took to visiting the sick room every morning at 11, always alone, always for precisely a quarter of an hour, and always with the same soft funereal gentleness that made the skin at the back of Verity's neck draw tight, though she could never afterwards say exactly why. He brought no comfort with him that she could identify, and yet he left, each time, having somehow rearranged the temperature of the room. "You are wearing yourself thin, cousin," he told her, on the 5th morning, using the word cousin with a warmth that implied an intimacy the marriage had never in fact produced. "No one would think the less of you for resting. Reeve is entirely capable, and I have engaged a very good nurse from the county town. Should you wish to be spared the worst of the nights?" "I do not wish to be spared them," Verity said. "He is my husband, of course." Julian smiled and smoothed one already immaculate cuff, a small precise gesture he made whenever he had said something he considered particularly well judged. "Though I wonder sometimes whether a woman married as you were married feels the word quite so heavily as the rest of us. No matter. It does you credit regardless." He left before she could answer, which she came to understand was itself a technique. A door closed on purpose before the retort could reach it. Below stairs the household had begun, within a week, to place informal wagers on whether the Duke would live to see Michaelmas, and Verity heard of it only because Nan Cobbett, scandalised on her behalf, reported it to her with the particular fury of a woman who considered gossip a species of vermin. 2-1 against, in the servants' hall, Nan said, banging a basin down harder than the basin deserved. And Mrs. Petch the housekeeper taking wages on top of it, which I told her was a wicked thing to do under a dying man's own roof, and she told me to mind my linens. "Let them wager," Verity said. She had not slept in her own bed in 9 days. She had moved a narrow cot into the dressing-room off Gerard's chamber and slept there in snatches, waking at every change in his breathing, and had taken over from Reeve's man the measuring of the sleeping draughts he was given each night, using her mother's own small tin case of spoons, the one engraved with the initials M.H., because she trusted her own hand and her own eye more than she trusted a household in mourning before its master was dead. It was on the 9th night, sitting by candlelight, with the dosing book open on her knee to record the hour and the measure as her mother had always insisted a careful hand must do, that she noticed the entry for 2 nights before had been altered. The ink of the figure was a slightly different black, laid a little heavier than the hand around it, as though someone had gone back afterward and changed a small number into a larger one. She sat very still, looking at it a long while, the candle guttering, and told herself it was nothing, a slip of Reeve's pen corrected in the moment, and wrote the observation down anyway on a scrap of paper that she folded twice and put inside her mother's tin beneath the spoons, where she kept the few things in the world she did not yet know what to do with. The nights had a shape to them by the 2nd week, a shape Verity had built herself out of necessity, the way a woman builds a path across a marsh by learning where the ground will hold. She read to him, in the hours when the house had gone quiet, not because Reeve had recommended it, but because her mother had believed the sick could hear more than they could answer. and because the alternative was sitting in silence with her own fear, which she had never found to be good company. She read him agricultural reports because they were what lay nearest to hand in his study, and then, when those ran thin, she read him her father's old letters. And then, on the 11th night, with no one to hear her but the candle and the dark, she began simply to talk to him as though he might answer. "You will think me foolish," she told him, telling a man his own accounts while he cannot object to my arithmetic. His hand lay slack on the counterpane, big-knuckled, a working man's hand, though he had never in his life done a working man's labour, and she had taken, without quite deciding to resting her own hand near it rather than on it, close enough that the warmth of him reached her fingers. "I did not expect to mind so much," she said more quietly. "I want you to know that, though you cannot hear it, and though I would deny it to your face if you woke and asked me. I did not marry you expecting to mind." It was, she realised as she said it, the nearest she had ever come to the truth, and she was glad, in a small shamed way, that he could not hear it, because a bargain kept its shape only so long as both parties held their side of it, and she had promised him need, not this. She was folding the blanket at his shoulder, an ordinary motion she had made 100 times, when his fingers moved. Not much, a slight closing, as though around reins that were not there, so brief she doubted her own eyes at first, and sat frozen a full minute waiting for it to happen again. It did not happen again that night. But she wrote it in the dosing book, in her own clear hand, beside the hour, the first entry in that book that was not a measure of medicine. His hand moved when I spoke his name. She told no one. She was not yet certain there was anything to tell, and something in her, some instinct older than sense, wanted to keep it, for now entirely her own, the way a woman keeps the first small sign of spring to herself a day or two, before she says the word aloud, for fear of saying it too soon and losing it. It was in the 3rd week, past midnight, with the heat finally breaking into a close and restless wind, that Verity heard voices outside the sick-room door, and went still on her cot rather than announce herself, some old instinct from her father's house, where creditors had taught her that what was said when a door was thought shut was often truer than what was said when it stood open. Julian Vane's voice, pitched even lower than usual, and Reeves, thin and unhappy beneath it. "He does not improve," Julian was saying. "You said yourself a fortnight, and it has been 3 weeks, and still he lies there, costing this family its peace and its good name before the county. I ask you, Reeve, as a man of conscience, is it kindness to prolong a suffering that cannot end in anything but grief? The draught you give him at night, increase it. Let him rest more deeply. Let him not wake to find himself half a man, if wake he ever does. I call that mercy. I do not know what else to call it." "It is a delicate matter of dosage, sir," Reeve said, and Verity, listening with her whole body gone cold and careful, heard in his voice the particular strain of a man being asked to agree to something he had not yet found the courage to refuse. "A delicate matter," Julian repeated, "which I am confident you will judge correctly, as you have judged it before." Nothing more was said that she could make out. Footsteps went away down the corridor, unhurried, and Verity lay a long while in the dark, turning the word mercy over and over like a coin whose face she could not quite read in poor light, unable to say whether it was a true coin or a false one, and hating, more than she had hated anything in 6 months, that she could not simply ask. The next morning Reeve informed the household, in a voice pitched for other ears besides Verity's, that certain irregularities had come to his attention in the sick-room draughts, Irregularities he could only attribute to interference by hands not properly trained to it, and that he must, with regret, request that the Duchess no longer take it upon herself to measure or record the Duke's medicine, as her well-meaning amateur habits with her mother's old apothecary tin had very likely done more harm than the fall itself. It was said gently. It was said, in fact, with the particular gentleness the household had learned to associate with Mr. Turner, Vane's own manner, and Verity, standing very still with her hand closed hard around the tin in her apron pocket, understood in one cold instant that the very carefulness that had kept her at her husband's side for 3 weeks running had just been turned, with a few soft words, into the evidence against her. Word of it went through Calderhouse by supper, and through the county by the following market day, the way such things always did, gathering weight as they travelled the way a snowball gathers snow. The Duchess had been meddling in the sick-room. The Duchess, who had married the Duke for his money in the first place, had perhaps not been entirely careful with his medicine, and who could say what a woman married for arithmetic might do if the arithmetic changed in her favour? No one said the word poison aloud. No one needed to. Lady Cassandra Fenwick, who had once hoped very sincerely to be Duchess of Calder herself, and had never fully forgiven the Shire for choosing otherwise, called upon Julian Vane that same week, and came away, by all accounts, considerably more certain of Verity's guilt than she had gone in, and repeated what she had heard to 3 separate dinner tables before the day was out. Verity heard all of it second-hand, through Nan, who reported each fresh cruelty with her jaw, set like a woman biting down on a nail, rather than spit it out in the wrong company. "They are saying you kept the tin to hide the dosing," Nan told her, in the small hours, in the kitchen, where the 2 of them had taken to sitting when the great house grew too heavy to bear. "As though your own mother's spoons were a murder weapon, and not the kindest thing in this house. Let them say it." Verity set her cup down. Precise, corner of the saucer aligned to the corner of the table, the way she aligned everything when her hands wanted something to hold steady. "I know what I measured. I wrote every grain of it down." "Then, show someone." "Show whom, Nan?" "Reeve has already said the fault is mine. Mr. Vane has already said it kindly, which is worse, because kindness cannot be argued with in a drawing-room the way an accusation can." It was 2 days later that Julian came to her in the small morning parlour, alone, and made his offer, in the same unhurried voice he used for everything, as though he were discussing the weather rather than her whole future. "A settlement," he said, "a generous one, more generous than the law required, and considerably more than her family's debt had ever been worth. A quiet departure to her father's house, before the hearing, with no scandal attached and no further questions asked, and a paper to sign renouncing any claim to guardianship of the estate or of her husband's person, should the commission find, as he gently supposed it must, that his Grace required a settled and steady hand rather than a young wife's inexperienced devotion. "You would spare yourself a great deal of unpleasantness," he said. "The hearing will not be kind to you, cousin, whatever the truth of the matter. I say this as a friend. You are not my friend, Mr. Vane," she said it without heat, the way one states a fact of weather. "And I will not sign away a claim I have not yet been shown to have forfeited." Something moved behind his eyes, there and gone, too quick to name. "A pity," he said. "I had hoped to spare us both an ugly month." He left with his cuffs as immaculate as they had arrived, and Verity stood a long while after the door had closed, understanding that she had just refused the easiest exit she would ever be offered, and that the county, hearing of the refusal, would call it not courage, but confirmation of guilt, because a woman with nothing to hide, they would say, would have taken the money and gone. The blow, when it came dressed as procedure rather than cruelty, which she had learned by now was the shape all of Julian Vane's blows preferred. Reeve, backed by 2 letters from physicians in the county town whom Julian had, it later emerged, engaged and paid for their opinions, before either had so much as examined the patient, declared the sick room too delicate an environment for a mistress whose presence had already once been implicated in irregularity, and Mrs. Petch, the housekeeper, acting on instructions she would only say had come from above her, informed Verity that her cot had been removed from the dressing-room, and that the night nursing had been given over entirely to a woman engaged from the county town. A stranger with capable hands and no history in the house at all. Verity was not forbidden the room outright. That would have looked too much like what it was. She was simply, gently, procedurally, made unwelcome in it, given fewer hours, watched more closely, asked politely by Reeve each time she entered whether her presence was strictly necessary, until the asking itself became a wall she had not the strength each day to climb. She took to sitting in the small morning parlour instead, where the light was thin, and the house's silence pressed on her like the August heat had pressed on the drive the night he came home. And it was there, on the 22nd night of the month, that Nan Cobbett found her and pressed into her hand a scrap of paper folded so small it might have been mistaken for lint. Found it under his pillow, Nan whispered, glancing twice at the door before she said another word, when I went to turn him, which I do myself now, whatever that woman from the town thinks she's paid for. His hand was still curled round it. I did not think a man 3 weeks insensible curls his hand round anything on purpose. Verity's own hands were not steady when she unfolded it. The writing was cramped and shaking, plainly forced out by a hand that had not held a pen in weeks, and had done it anyway, letter by letter, in the dark, with no one to see. "Watch the ink," it said. "I have not been sleeping so long as they believe. Trust no one but Nan, and the tin. Say nothing yet." She read it 3 times before the sense of it settled fully into her, and when it did, the room seemed to tilt very slightly, the way a room tilts when a person realizes a thing they had grieved is not, after all, entirely lost. He was awake. He had been awake, by some measure, long enough to hear whatever had been said outside his door, and had chosen deliberately to let the house believe him gone, in order to see, she understood now with a coldness that had nothing to do with the night air, exactly who would come to his bedside, and exactly what they would say when they believed he could not answer. She thought of Julian's soft voice in the dark. Increase the dose. Let him not wake to find himself half a man. He had heard that. He had heard it, and he had said nothing, and he had trusted her with nothing but 4 sentences, because 4 sentences folded small enough to hide in a curled hand were all that a man 3 weeks feigning death could manage to write, and even that, she understood, looking again at the scrap of paper, had very nearly cost him everything. She did not sleep that night, though not from grief this time. She sat with the note pressed flat inside her mother's tin, beneath the spoons, beside the folded scrap that recorded the altered dosing entry from 3 weeks before, and began, for the first time since the accident, to think not as a frightened wife but as her mother's daughter, the girl who had once balanced a failing man's ledgers into solvency, out of nothing but stubbornness and arithmetic. In the morning she went to Nan with a short, careful list of what she needed, and Nan, who had spent 40 years reading the difference between a woman falling apart and a woman closing ranks, asked no questions beyond the practical ones. They needed, first, the dosing book itself, which Reeve kept locked in his own bag, but which Nan, who had emptied that bag of linens and instruments 100 times over the years, knew how to reach without seeming to try. They needed a private word with Tam Sowerby, the apothecary's boy from the county town, who came twice weekly to grind and measure what Reeve prescribed. A shy, work-reddened young man of perhaps 17, who had, Nan reported, taken to avoiding Verity's eye in the kitchen passage, in a manner that suggested either guilt or fright, and very possibly both. And they needed, above all, to know how much of himself Gerard Ashworth had recovered behind his still face, because a proof laid before the county's justices by a discredited wife and a servant would be dismissed as conspiracy. But a proof confirmed by the Duke's own testimony could not be dismissed at all. That night, when the hired nurse had gone down for her supper, Verity slipped into the sick room alone for the first time in a week, and sat close and said his name, very low. His eyes opened, not fully, a narrow band of grey beneath heavy lids, fixed on her with an effort she could see cost him, but opened and held her, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 3 weeks let go all at once, so sharply it was almost pain. "You wicked, wicked man," she whispered, and found she was smiling and near weeping in the same breath, which had never in her life happened to her at once before. His mouth moved. No sound came, or almost none, but she read the shape of it the way she had learned to read every small motion of him these 3 weeks, and the shape of it was her name, and then, a moment later, 4 more words she had to lean close to catch at all. "Not surrender," he said, "only watching." She understood him at once, because it was, in its bones, her mother's own maxim handed back to her transformed, and she pressed his hand, the first time in 3 weeks she had allowed herself to hold it rather than merely rest beside it, and told him, in a whisper fierce enough to surprise them both, that they had 4 days left before the hearing, and a very great deal of work to do before he could stop watching and start, at last, to speak. Tam Sowerby broke, in the end, not under threat but under kindness, which Verity had learned by then was very often the surer instrument. She found him alone in the still-room on the morning before the hearing, grinding a measure of chalk into powder with hands that would not quite keep still, and instead of accusing him she simply set her mother's tin on the table between them, opened it, and asked him, gently, whether he recognised the spoon inside marked with a small file mark at its lip. He went very white. "Mr. Vane said it was for the gentleman's comfort," he said, before she had asked him anything more than that. He said his own physician had recommended it, that a man in the Duke's condition felt nothing and suffered less the sooner it was done, and that it would be a mercy, and that I was only a boy, and no one would think the worse of me for following a physician's order, even one given quiet, even one given at night, when Dr. Reeve himself did not wish his own name written against it. He put his face in his hands, 17 years old and shaking. "I did not want him dead, ma'am. I swear it on my mother. I only did as I was told, and I am sick every night for the doing of it." Verity did not raise her voice. She had learned, watching Julian Vane all these weeks, exactly what a raised voice cost a person in a room, and she did not intend to spend hers so cheaply. "Then you will tell the justices exactly what you have told me," she said, "word for word. And you will bring whatever note or instruction Mr. Vane gave you, if any survives, because a boy as careful as you strikes me as a boy who keeps things. He kept things, He produced from beneath a loose stone in the still-room floor 2 folded letters, in a hand Verity recognised instantly from 6 months of household accounts, unsigned but unmistakable, instructing in careful, gentle, deniable language that the night draught be strengthened by degrees, that no note of the increase be entered in Reeve's book, and that the boy be assured he was doing a Christian kindness. She read them once, standing very still in the still-room's cool dimness, with the smell of dried lavender all around her, and felt something in her that had been afraid for 3 weeks turn, quite suddenly, into something that was not afraid at all. That evening the storm that had been building all week finally broke over Calder House, thunder rolling down the vale, and rain coming in sheets against the windows of the room where Gerard, sitting propped now against his pillows for the first time since the accident, weak as a man, twice his age, but entirely, unmistakably present, listened while Verity laid before him, item by item, everything 4 weeks had given her, the altered dosing book, her mother's tin and its careful record, Tam's 2 letters, and her own testimony of what she had overheard outside his door on the 21st night. He listened without once interrupting, his jaw set in the stillness she had come, over 6 months and 1 very long month, to recognise as the shape his anger wore when it had nowhere else to go. 4 weeks, he said at last, his voice still rough with disuse, and you built the case that will save this house, while every soul in it believed you the danger in it. I had a great deal of quiet to work in, Verity said. Everyone was so very sure I could do nothing, that no one troubled to watch what I was doing. Outside the thunder cracked directly overhead, and neither of them flinched, and in the flash of white light that followed, she saw him smile, faintly for what she understood, with a small shock of tenderness, might have been the first time in the whole of their acquaintance that she had watched it happen, rather than been told of it afterward. The hearing room in the county town was not a grand chamber, only the long panelled room above the market hall, where the justices met 4 times a year to settle boundary disputes and poor rates, but it was full that morning, as it had rarely been full before, because word had gone round the shire that the Duke of Calder, given up for lost by half the county, would be carried in to have his own fate decided in his hearing, if not, as most still believed, in his understanding. Sir Aldous Penrose, the senior magistrate, a heavy, deliberate man known for asking few questions and remembering every answer, presided from behind a table bare of everything but a Bible and an inkstand, and Julian Vane sat below him with the composed, faintly sorrowful bearing of a man about to accept a painful duty for the good of his family, his case laid out by his own solicitor in orderly, sympathetic terms. A duke insensible a month and worsening, a young duchess whose interference with the sick-room medicine was attested by the family's own physician, a household in need, for its own protection, of a settled hand until the true state of his Grace's mind could be determined. Dr. Reeve, called first, gave his testimony in the thin, unhappy voice of a man reciting a lesson he had not fully believed even while learning it, and confirmed, when pressed by Julian's solicitor, that irregularities in the dosing book had indeed coincided with the Duchess's presence in the sick-room. It was, on its face, a tidy case, and Verity, sitting very straight beside the wheeled chair in which Gerard had been brought, his eyes closed, his hands folded, playing to the room the very stillness he had played to his own household for a month, felt the weight of every eye in that chamber settle on her like a physical thing. When her turn came, she did not raise her voice either. She had learned that lesson too well by now to forget it in a room full of strangers. She laid her mother's tin upon the table before Sir Aldous, and opened it, and set beside it the dosing book taken, with Nan's help, from Reeve's own bag, opened to the entry 3 weeks changed, and asked the magistrate himself to hold the page to the window light, where the difference in the ink lay plain as a scar for anyone with eyes to see it. I recorded every measure I gave His Grace in my own hand, in a book my mother taught me to keep before I was of an age to keep secrets, she said. I will set my record beside Dr. Reeve's for any physician in this room to compare, grain for grain, and I will ask that Tam Sowerby, who mixed the draughts these 3 weeks past, be brought in and asked, under oath, who instructed him to strengthen them by night, and why no note of it was ever entered. Tam was brought in white-faced and shaking, and it was Sir Aldous himself, in the flat, unhurried voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly which question a frightened witness could not evade, who asked it. "Who told you, boy, to double the night drought on the 20th, and to keep no record of the doing?" There was a silence in that room long enough for the rain still ticking against the windows to be the loudest sound in it, and then Tam Sowerby lifted his head and looked, not at Verity, not at Sir Aldous, but straight across the room at Julian Vane, and said, in a voice that cracked once and then held, "You did, sir. You told me it was Mercy." The 2 letters went onto the table next, and were read aloud in Sir Aldous' flat, carrying voice, every careful, deniable, damning phrase of them, and Verity watched Julian Vane's face while they were read and saw, for the first time in 6 months, something in it move that was not calculation. It was in the silence after the letters that Gerard Ashworth opened his eyes fully, before the whole room, and spoke for the first time in a month in a voice roughened by disuse but entirely his own. "I heard you," he said to Julian, without heat, which made it worse than heat could have. "The 21st night, outside my own door. You called it Mercy then too." The room came apart into murmurs, and was silenced again by Sir Aldous' raised hand, and Julian Vane, cornered at last in the one currency he had never learned to spend, which was plain truth spoken aloud before witnesses, sat very still for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, began to speak, not in defence, but in something nearer confession, his composure cracking at last into something raw and almost pitiable. His father, he said, had been the elder son once, the true heir, before a debt of honour and a scandal not entirely of his own making had stripped him of everything, and left his branch of the family to be tolerated rather than loved, invited to Christmas and left out of wills. And Julian had grown from a boy watching his father die a poor man's death in a rich man's shadow into one who had promised himself, very young, that he would never again be the cousin who was merely permitted. He had not meant, he said, his voice thinning, for it to come to this. He had meant only to be secure before the accounting came due. The accounting he had known for 2 years was coming. The estate's books not quite so clean as he had kept them looking. When the fall came, unbidden, unplanned by him, he told the room, straining at the one truth he seemed to think might still be believed. He had seen in it not a crime to commit, but a door left open by chance. And he had, God forgive him, walked through it. It was Verity, of everyone in that room, who spoke first into the silence that followed, because she had spent a month learning exactly what mercy this house required, and exactly what it could not afford. "He is not owed forgiveness," she said to Sir Aldous, "but neither, I think, is he owed a public ruin that falls as heavily on a family already once disgraced through no fault of the son. Let it be a quiet settlement, an allowance, sufficient but not generous, paid so long as he lives abroad and troubles this house no further. Gerard, from his chair, did not disagree. He looked at his cousin a long moment, and when he spoke it was Julian's own words handed back to him, spoken once, weeks before, in a very different room, to a very different purpose. "Mercy," Gerard said, "is a debt paid by the strong to the weak, you told my wife once, and warned her you were not weak enough to owe it. Be glad, then, cousin, that I am." The storm had cleared by the time they came home to Calder House. The sky over the vale washed to a thin, rain-scoured gold, and the household that had wagered on the Duke's death now stood along the drive in a silence that had, this time, nothing of pity in it, and everything of shame. Reeve's practice did not survive the season. His shingle came down quietly before Michaelmas, and no charge was ever laid against him beyond the ruin of his own name, which Verity, remembering his thin, unhappy voice in that room, judged punishment enough for a man who had lacked the courage to refuse rather than the wickedness to invent. Tam Sowerby was given, at Verity's own asking, a position with an honest apothecary in the county town who had known her mother, and wrote to her, that Christmas and every Christmas after, a letter thanking her for a mercy he said he had done nothing to deserve, to which she always replied that the deserving of mercy was never really the point of it. Lady Cassandra Fenwick, who had carried Julian's gossip to 3 dinner tables without once troubling to ask whether it was true, came to Calder House within the week, stiff with an unaccustomed humility, and made an apology so plainly costly to her pride that Verity found she could not, in the end, refuse to accept it, and the 2 women, to the surprise of the whole county, became something that was not quite friendship, but was a good deal warmer than the coldness that had gone before it. Nan Cobbett wept at the small private Thanksgiving service held in the chapel that autumn, wept loudly and without a trace of shame, and told everyone within earshot afterward that she had known, from the very first poor cold wedding, that the bargain would make a decent marriage, though she had rather hoped, she admitted, it would not take quite so near a death to prove her right. It was on an evening some weeks after, with the last of the harvest light lying long and gold across the garden, and a wren singing, as it had sung on the night he was carried home, from somewhere deep in the hedge, that Gerard found Verity sitting on the stone bench where she had first read agricultural reports aloud to a man who could not answer, and sat down beside her with the careful, deliberate movement of a man still learning the full use of his own strength again. "You told me once," he said, "that I need not love you, only need you." "I remember. I have spent a month," he said, "learning the very great difference between the two, from a bed I could not leave, watching you prove yourself the one soul in this house who never once asked what the arrangement required of her before she gave more than it did." He did not take her hand at once. He set his own beside it on the stone, the old gesture, waiting, the way he had waited that first night in her father's dining room, for her to close the bargain on her own terms rather than his. "I do not offer you need this time," he said. "I have discovered I no longer require the word. I love you, Verity. I loved you, I think, some while before I knew myself well enough to say it, and I say it now owing you nothing, asking nothing of you that the law or the estate or 4 weeks of feigned death might explain away as gratitude. Marry me again, if you will have the same man twice over, not because you are needed, only because I wish it, and hope, though I have no right to, that you may wish it too." Verity looked at him a long moment, the wren still singing, the gold light moving on the grass the way light moves on a floor left otherwise undisturbed, and found that the answer she gave him was not new at all, only the old one turned, at last, the right way round. "I did not stay all those weeks because you needed me," she said. "I stayed because I had already begun, before I dared say so even to myself, to love you. Stillness was never surrender, my mother used to tell me. I understand now that neither was mine." They were married again the following spring, quietly, in the same small chapel, with Nan weeping in the front pew exactly as she had wept in the autumn, and this time the wren was singing when they came out into the light. A year almost to the night from the day the horse came up the drive without its rider, Verity stood again on the front steps of Calder House at dusk, and heard hoofs on the gravel, and this time she did not run down in fear, but walked down unhurried, smiling, to meet her husband riding home whole and easy under a sky gone rose and gold at the edges. And he swung down from the saddle the way a man dismounts who has somewhere warm and certain to be, and took her hand, not because the bargain required it, but because, after everything, it was simply where his hand most wished to be. Stillness, she thought, watching him cross the last of the gravel toward her, had never once been surrender. It had been how she loved him all along, long before either of them had the courage to call it by its name. If this story warmed you even a little, if you found yourself hoping, the way I did, that the quiet ones are watching more closely than anyone gives them credit for, then stay a while longer by the fire with me. There is a chair kept here, and a kettle always near the boil, and I would love nothing more than to hear which moment stayed with you longest, the note curled in a still hand, or the tin with its small worn spoons, or the wren singing through it all. Keep your place by this hearth if you'd like more evenings like this one. It costs nothing but a moment, and it means a great deal to me. Until the next story finds you, be gentle with the quiet ones who sit up all night keeping watch, and sleep well, knowing that stillness, more often than we think, is only love that has not yet found its voice.